we did about the choosing by advantage and the comparison of that method with the traditional method of the contractor selection in the Colombian industry. So first, I'm going to introduce you to the importance of the multi-criteria decision analysis and why choosing by advantage is a method of that approach. After that, I'm going to expose the main objective that we want to achieve with this research. After that, I'm going to show you the traditional method used in the Colombian industry in order to expose the case study used and the results obtained by both methods. After, I'm going to discuss the results and then finally show the conclusion of this research. So we know that the construction projects are present in environments that we can manage because they are affected for many variables. For example, legal framework, culture, weather, economic framework. And in addition with that, the initial conditions where the projects are planned can change across the different stages of the life cycle of the projects. So the construction managers have to take decisions that are affected for multiple objectives, and that objectives are affected for the opinions and preference of the many stakeholders involved. An example of that, the traditional example, is our construction projects want to achieve and increase the value in the different stage of the project. And one example of that is the construction manager want to increase the quality, controlling different variables like cost, time, and scope. So, for example, the selection of contractor is a decision that we have to take in the beginning of the project, and in the beginning of the project we have a higher level of uncertainty and risk. So due to the multidisciplinary nature and the presence of many stakeholders in the project, the decision that we have to take are decisions that involves multiple objectives, and we have to take an approach and a tool that allows to implement that objectives. So that is the importance of the multi-criteria decision analysis, and the multi-criteria decision analysis is a tool that allows to implement or solve a problem, taking into account different criteria in order to evaluate the alternatives that we have. So that is the typical structure of a problem of multi-criteria decision analysis. The multi-criteria decision analysis has two levels. The first level is the managerial level that defines the objectives that we want to achieve in that problem and defines the best alternative. The second level is the engineering level that defines the alternatives that we have and evaluates the consequence of choosing each alternative, taking into account the different criteria that we have. So there are many methods of multi-criteria decision analysis, and the method that we want to use in our problem depends on the characteristics of the problem, but I think that is more important the information that we have of the problem and the nature of that information. So choosing by advantage is a method of the multi-criteria decision analysis that, compared with the other methods, construct the preference, taking into account the comparison of the advantage between the alternatives. So choosing by advantage is considered in the literature that can allow or consider more factors than the other methods, for example, social and environmental factors. The process of implement that method is summarized in 7 steps. We first have to identify the alternatives, then define the factors, then define the criteria for each factor. After that, we have to summarize the attributes for each alternative, and then we have to do the most important process, that is define the advantage of the alternatives in order to define the importance of that advantage. As we can see, with the difference with this method with the other is that this method don't consider or doesn't treat the cost as a factor. So the main objective of this research is compare the traditional method of contractor selection in Colombian industry with the choosing by advantage method using a case study that is a building construction in our university. We want to validate if CBA allows to consider more factors than the traditional method, and if the cost can skew the final decision in the traditional method. So what is the method used in the Colombian industry? We know that the construction selection process is a complex process because we don't know the nature and the quality of the information that we have, the different alternatives. So there is a law in Colombia that regulates this process, that exposes the main principles that we have to take into account in this process. So that law says that we have to reduce the subjectivity in the process, and we have to include more factors like legal capacity, financial capacity, experience, or organizational capacity. It's important to note that this law is an obligation for the public projects, but for the private projects, it is only a guide. And the proportional of these factors depends in the natural of the contractor that we want to select. So for this research, we did a case study that is a building, a university faculty construction. In our university is the architectural faculty. It's a building of 1,500 square meters. There are many classrooms and offices here. And it's important to know that in the moment that we implement choosing by advantage the decision of what is the structural contractor selection was already taken. So I'm going to show you first the traditional results or results obtained by the traditional method, and after I'm going to show you the CBI results. So for the traditional results, we can see that we consider two principal criteria, that is the technical evaluation and the economical evaluation. We have here that the technical evaluation has the 30% of the points, and the economical evaluation have 70% of the points. But it's important to note that the cost factor has 55% of the points. We can see here that the cost skew the final selection because we have four alternatives. The alternatives D, that was the cheapest, obtained all the points for the cost factor and was the alternative selected. But we know that this alternative is the worst for the technical evaluation and other factors in the economical evaluation. So for CBR results, you can see in the table the results obtained for the first step of this process. So first we have the four alternatives that we have in this contractor. We define the different factors. We have factors for economical evaluation and technical evaluation. For example, here we have a factor for experience that is years in construction. So we define the different factors, and after that we have to define the criteria for each factor. So for example, it's more important I have more experience. So here we have that it's better have more years in construction. After defining the criteria for each factor, we have to summarize the attributes for each alternative. So we have the attributes for each alternative for each factor. After that, we have to identify what is the worst alternative here. The worst alternative is D. After that, we have to compare within the alternatives and identify the advantage that has each alternative with the worst. So here, the best alternative is the alternative A, and in that order of ideas, this alternative has more importance. So here, for the technical evaluation, we have that the best alternative is the C and the worst is the D. That is the best in the traditional method. Here we have the same process for the economical evaluation, but it's important to know that here we don't use the cost as a factor. So we have the results and we obtained that the best alternative was the C, and the worst was the D with CBI results. It's important to know that the difference between the budget of the projects between the alternative C and the D is no significant. It's more or less like $300,000. And we can see the difference between manage a project in the world value and in the world cost. We have the worst alternative in many criteria that is the selected because was the cheapest. So here we have the results with the traditional method, and the difference between the two best alternatives was only 1 point. The alternative selected was the D, and the difference within the C was 1 point. But with the CBR results, we have a significant resolve with that the points. And we have to clear that the alternative D was the worst in many of their factors. So we can conclude that we can compare both methods, and we can see that the CBA method considers more factors than the traditional method, and we can see that the cost in the traditional method can skew the final selection. But it's important to clear that this research doesn't validate if the factors considered in the decision are the correct. Thank you.